So, Matt Frei, we're going to talk about Germany and its response to the war in Ukraine and how it in some ways can't quit Russia. What are you going to tell me today?
The war in Ukraine is a kind of wake-up moment, soul-searching moment for just about every country around the world, whether it's China or the United States or Britain or Poland or the Baltic republics, but also, and maybe especially Germany, because this is for Germany the moment that Germany has to step out of the shadow of its own history of starting World War II under Adolf Hitler and say we are a responsible, militarily responsible partner on the European stage, and we will take on Russia militarily and politically in a way that we've never done so before.
Matt Frei, you are our Europe editor. You were in Ukraine earlier this year, before the war, and then when the war broke out.
They've been traveling for days, if not weeks, leaving their homes behind. And this is just the start of their odyssey. They have no idea what the future holds for them.
And you were also born in Germany. And that's the country we want to focus on today and talk about its approach to the Ukraine conflict and how that war has sort of changed Germany's foreign policy and forced it to essentially rethink its place in Europe and the world. So let's start at the beginning. Following the invasion, the Chancellor Olaf Scholz addressed the Bundestag and he spoke of, let me see if I've got my German right here.
Zeitenwende.
Zeitenwende. What does that mean and why was it such an important word in speech?
It means basically, literally translated, means time change. But it's a kind of one of those sort of hefty, weighty, composite German nouns. And you use it to indicate a major milestone in history, which is indeed what this war was, because literally until about a week before the war, Germany wasn't even prepared to consider some of the more important economic sacrifices like the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the new pipeline that was agreed with the previous German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, that then came into, was started to be planned almost immediately afterwards. He, a predecessor of Olaf Scholz of the same party, became the lead lobbyist on the Nord Stream 2 project, and we'll talk about that later. And this pipeline that went directly from Russia to Germany was bypassing the Baltic republics and bypassing Ukraine, obviously, was going to be one of the main sources of energy for Germany. And he had come under pressure, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, to scrap this project for some time, almost as soon as he took office. It was first brought up by one Donald Trump, by the way, at the NATO summit in Brussels 3 years ago, where he said, you've got to scrap Nord Stream 2. Angela Merkel, what are you doing, buying all that gas from the Russians? And at the time, everyone thought that Trump was a lunatic for even mentioning it.
But he was right.
And he was right. A couple of other things he was right on.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later as well. Anyway, so Scholz had already kind of approached the altar of economic sacrifice by saying before the war even started, we're going to scrap this project. That was a difficult decision for him to make at the time. The next thing he did, once the invasion was out there and it was obvious and the world was in shock, is that he stood up in the Bundestag on a Sunday, and that's when he had his Zeitenwende moment. He basically said, we, the Germans, are going to have to rearm. And, we're going to have to step up to the plate in the way that the Americans have always wanted us to, but we're going to do more than that. We're going to actually spend more than the percentage required by NATO on armaments. We're going to spend 2.5% as opposed to 2%. We're going to spend that money.
This is a major challenge for the entire country. It means to have a modern, progressive German armed forces, Bundeswehr, that can protect us. In the Munich Security Conference a week ago, I said we need aircraft, we need ships, and we need soldiers who are well equipped, ideally equipped for their missions. That's what it's about. The 2022 German budget will have 100 billion euros earmarked for this as a one-off, and this money will be used for investment in the German armed forces.
And the idea that you can have the headline, Germany rearms, Europe relieved, shows you how much the world has changed. Because Germany's European partners, including the Poles, who've had a very difficult history with Germany, always wanted the Germans to do more on defense. And now the Germans have done that. But that's the easy part. That speech was the easy bit. Actually implementing not just the spending, but then sending the right weapons to Ukraine at the right time of the war has been politically very contentious, has strained the ruling coalition, has brought out some real surprises, including, perhaps most prominently, that the Green Party, which when it was first founded in 1980, put in its manifesto, in its founding manifesto, get rid of NATO, get rid of the German Bundeswehr, the German army, no more weapons anywhere. Germany has to be a completely pacifist nation. The Greens are now the most strident members of the coalition when it comes to armaments for Ukraine, but we'll talk about that later.
So when he talks about a turning point, that's sort of essentially a very easy thing to say. But given that it is so seismic, what we've seen in the weeks and months since is that he's...
Well, it's not an easy, it's not an easy thing to say.
Has he got cold feet? Because
Well, no, it's not,
the Ukrainians say they're not getting the weapons, they're not getting what they were promised.
It's not an easy thing to say for a German chancellor, because the weight of history of the Second World War, of Nazi Germany, of Hitler's invasion of the rest of Europe, still weighs heavily on... It's part of, the political DNA of any German politician, and particularly complex inside the Social Democrat Party of Olaf Scholz. So not an easy thing to say, but he said it, and he was roundly applauded. The implementation of it is, though, quite tricky. And you can measure the military commitment of European Western countries to Ukraine by the range of missiles and weaponry that they send. The longer range the stuff you send, and at the moment there are not many people sending the really long range stuff that could hit Russia from inside Ukraine, the more you believe that the biggest crisis here is not the defeat of Vladimir Putin that could make him do something irrational and radical like throwing nukes, but the biggest crisis of Ukraine is Russian imperialism, Russia behaving like Nazi Germany, taking over the whole of Europe. And essentially the world at the moment, the geopolitical world, is divided into two camps. Those who fear the defeat of Putin and the victory of Ukraine, pushing Russia into that corner, and those who believe that if they don't defeat Vladimir Putin, he will push the rest of Europe into a corner where it doesn't want to be. And Britain, Poland, the Baltic republics are on one side of that debate. The British government's been quite clear, we need to defeat Vladimir Putin. Ukraine has to win. Whereas the Germans, the French, the Italians, and the Dutch are on the other side of that debate, saying Putin must not win. Ukraine must not lose. But you don't hear Olaf Scholz saying Ukraine must win. Those are different words. And then America is somewhere in the middle, because Joe Biden famously said, I will send them heavy weaponry, but I will not send them the stuff that can hit Russia from inside Ukraine, because that would lead to a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. Now, the Russians believe they're already in that confrontation, but NATO does not.
Because I want to get into more about, the way that Germany has set itself up and how it views itself after the Second World War. But on that point, it's almost going back to the First World War in the sense that Olaf Scholz said, I am not Kaiser Wilhelm. I'm not the leader during the First World War. Because what's he saying there? He's saying that he doesn't want to get lulled into a war. They want to learn the lessons of, a humiliated Germany, then being angered leading up to the Second World War. What's he talking about there? What's the fear?
There are several fears there. The First World War was something that, the great powers of Europe slithered into almost by mistake. And there's a wonderful quote from Kaiser Wilhelm II speaking to his cousin Tsar Nicholas II and King George V, saying, if Granny had been alive, none of this would have happened. And Granny was, of course, Queen Victoria. So you have the grandchildren of Queen Victoria, who are now running different empires in Europe, all falling out with each other because of a tectonic diplomatic arrangement whereby if the Serbian nationalists attack the Austro-Hungarians, then a system of coalitions will come into play whereby the whole of Europe will be at each other's throats. That is what they want to avoid. And I guess what he's saying is, we don't want to slither into a position, slide into an unwanted global conflict, a World War III, because of allegiances around Ukraine. That's what he's saying there. And of course, what happened at the end of World War I is that the whole monopoly board of European politics was thrown up in the air. The Tsar lost his job and then his head finally. There were revolutions all over Europe. And obviously that's what they're afraid of. It's not just World War III, we could all get annihilated by nukes, but also the political landscape that we all know, that we've all got used to, which has given us unprecedented peace and prosperity, if we don't handle this carefully, could be kicked up, upended, overturned, to create something which is unrecognizable and possibly, if history were to repeat itself, a lot nastier.
So the way that Germany approaches Ukraine is clearly based on its history. And, we started off by talking about the German word Zeitenwende, but there's another German word about learning to live with the past, which deals with how Germany has approached itself.
Vergangenheitsbewältigung. You have to make time for this word. It's got lots of consonants and a few vowels in there as well, just for good measure. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means literally past overcoming, past management.
And that's how they approached the aftermath of Nazi Germany.
Yes. So there were lots of other words to do with that as well, but essentially denazification a lot of it was about Vergangenheitsbewältigung, how to overcome your past. Now, some people thought that meant denying your past or forgetting about it, and other people thought actually this meant talking about your past, doing lots of soul searching, not repeating the mistakes of the past. Now, the German-Russia relationship, and I know this from my own family, is a very specific and very complex one that touches all sorts of historical neurological points. My parents were both refugees at the end of the Second World War and were running away from the Russians, who were exacting in many cases some pretty brutal revenge on the people who had just killed 20 million of them. And they were running away from the Russians to get to the western sectors of occupation in Germany, which is either mainly the British or the American sectors. And they were doing so at the end of a war which their parents knew was deeply unjust, in which there was no sympathy for the Germans who'd lost that war, because they started it and they killed an awful lot of people in the process. So this is getting back to your question. The German attitude towards Russia, despite the violence of the history between these two countries, is defined by a complex of guilt, of collective guilt about what the Nazis did to the Russians. And also a sense of geography, that we have to get on with the Russians, we Germans, because they're right next door. In between is a country called Poland, which actually for 130 years ceased to exist entirely. It was basically Germany rubbing up against the Russian Empire. The German Empire rubbing up against the Russian Empire, with Poland as a kind of buffer zone that disappeared at one stage.
Even Ukraine, which was also occupied by the Nazis.
But in all those areas of Middle Europe are like a flat, you remember that game Risk? Anyway, so imagine a flat board for Risk, where the borders can be changed. There are no natural boundaries. I mean, there are a couple of rivers, but there are no great mountain ranges. And so identity in that part of Europe is defined by language, by history, by culture, but not necessarily by natural borders. We don't know that living on the island of Britain, because we are very lucky that we have these natural borders, but they don't have that. So things are constantly shifting. But again, getting back to that German-Russian relationship, and this is very much part of the DNA of the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. It is very much part of his party, the Social Democrat Party, that has always tried to find an accommodation with the Russians, partly because of historical guilt, partly because they're afraid of, Mother Russia, the Russian bear next door on that same flat landmass where the borders can shift, but also, of course, pragmatically, economically, because they need Russian energy for the German export economy to thrive.
And on that point of the German guilt from the war, that's why Germany has up until now been so hesitant about having any military involvement anywhere, or to ever pump money into its army, because of, as you said, the headline of the idea of a militarized Germany.
Yes, that's the historical reason, and it's a really handy excuse as well. Do you really want us to rearm? Really? Germany? Come on. I'd rather spend that, that 1.5% I should be spending on weapons. I'd spend it on something else. There's another problem, Kieran, that over the years of, first of all, post-Cold War stability, prosperity, complacency, a feeling that, the Russians, they're a bit frothy, but we can handle them. That was very much Angela Merkel's thing, for which he's being criticized now. But also, in the post-Cold War absence of an immediate nuclear jeopardy, the German army became really terrible. I mean, it's a terrible army. They're terrible equipment, not enough equipment. One of the reasons why the Germans are slow in sending all these tanks that they've promised the Ukrainians is that they haven't got them.
But when it comes to Germany's relationship with Russia, is the belief that the way they approached Russia, ever since, Willy Brandt in the 70s with the new Ostpolitik, a normalization of relations with Moscow, the idea is that policy from the 70s up until before the war in Ukraine, it was working.
I wouldn't say until before the war in Ukraine, but it was working. The high point of that policy was that Germany was in a position to reassure Russia enough in order to allow a united Germany to join NATO, to be in NATO, to carry on in NATO. This is a massive deal. Imagine Britain, is missing Scotland and Northern Ireland. They are part of an American zone of occupation, and America's the enemy. And you manage to reunify Great Britain and get back Northern Ireland and Scotland without a single shot being fired. This is the stuff of dreams. And that dream, that miracle, came true after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall collapsed essentially because President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union at the time did not have the will, or the economic clout, or the military conviction that you can put down, a radical movement for reform, a bid for freedom by killing people in a public square. But that year, about 1989, when the wall fell, that was the choice before those leaders. You can either do a Tiananmen Square and mow everyone down, you're going to kill lots of people, it's going to be absolutely brutal, but you stay in charge. Or you can do a Gorbachev. You can open your doors, you can have perestroika and glasnost, openness and reconstruction. You can reform. But what happens when you reform if you are an autocratic regime? It falls apart. The sandcastle just disintegrates. That's what happened with the Soviet Union. That's why we're here. That's why we're talking about Ukraine. It's to right that particular wrong in Vladimir Putin's mind. And so for the Germans, there was this unique moment where there was a will of the East German people to break free. There was a lack of a will of the Soviet troops based in East Germany to do something about it militarily. And as the Berlin Wall fell, it was like the keystone being taken out of the arch. The rest of the Soviet Union followed.
As that history then takes us right up to the present day, where you have Angela Merkel recently coming out and essentially defending the way that she dealt with Moscow and Vladimir Putin during her chancellorship.
I don't think I miscalculated, and I'm not going to apologize. I don't know what would have been gained if Putin had simply carried on in 2014 without anyone caring. In retrospect, I'm actually glad that I don't have to blame myself for not trying to prevent an event like this. On the contrary, I did try, hand in hand with successive French presidents, and this gives me a form of comfort.
Even though we know that that friendly relationship hasn't been helpful to where we are today, even when we have Gerhard Schroeder, her predecessor, who was having to leave the board of directors of a Russian oil giant, Rosneft. Why is it so difficult for them to admit that that wasn't the right policy?
Because until recently, until the war, the Germans were literally having their Kuchen and eating it,
Yeah.
because they were able to engage Russia enough to sort of keep them under some control, while at the same time using cheap Russian energy to power their export engine. And this became tricky after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, and the Germans were indeed, at the forefront in Europe of imposing sanctions, but not sanctions that were severe enough for Vladimir Putin to change his mind about his next desires on Ukraine, his next calculations. So there's always, I think, if you talk to German politicians, they will say, and I think they're probably broadly speaking right, the policy of engagement with Russia worked really well up to a point, and then we lost the plot. And losing the plot came, in a number of manifestations. The most obvious example was Gerhard Schröder, the former German Chancellor, who got on really well with Vladimir Putin. Why? Because, this is one explanation, they had both come to power more or less at the same time. They both didn't speak English. They both came from poor backgrounds. Schröder was one of 5 kids of a single mum and had always wanted to make money after he left office. They were the new kids on the block, and they Bill Clinton was a bit grand for them, and then after that, George W. Bush was a bit troubling for them. And Tony Blair was also a bit too too posh and mellifluous for these two rough diamonds. So they kind of bonded over this. But then Angela Merkel comes along. Angela Merkel, the Queen of Europe, we all cherished her for years as the reasonable, sensible adult, driving the European kind of minibus, with Donald Trump in the fast lane going nuts,
Yeah.
And now the mood has turned against her, not just in the rest of Europe, but also in Germany itself. You, Angela, were, schmoozing up to Vladimir Putin in Russian, because of course she spoke fluent Russian, and he to you in German, when you should have been much tougher with him. And she still says, she just said it the other day, unapologetically, engagement is the only way to go.
if individuals like Merkel and then now Scholz are sort of, in some ways, carry the weight of history with them, especially Scholz, because his SPD party has such a long history of normalizing relations with Russia. Is this a generational divide going on in Germany? Because the polling would suggest that many Germans are saying, look, we actually want to arm Ukraine. We want Ukraine to win. We know there's going to be high prices, there's going to be inflation, the end of the Nord Stream pipeline, whatever. We want to do this. But it's the older generation, the Scholzes, against in his coalition of the Greens, who you mentioned before. They're the ones pushing for change. Is that not what's happening in this turning point?
There's a really interesting thing going on here. First of all, the numbers about who wants serious military engagement with Ukraine are changing all the time. So just before the war, it was like 42%. In the first few weeks after the war, when he gave his famous speech, which we started the podcast with, that Zeitenwende speech, it was about 62%. Now it's slipped down again. So again, the degree to which the German public is prepared to, send heavy weapons to Ukraine and have a cold winter next winter when they can't afford to buy gas wherever they're going to get it from, if those sanctions actually kick in, the degree to which that gets support is the degree to which they fear that this might become a wider conflagration. At the same time, there is this weird generational divide. So when Olaf Scholz, who can't, is in a lose-lose situation right now. The Ukrainians don't like him because he's not sending the good stuff over to Kyiv. The old socialist foxes in his own party think that he's a warmonger. He turns up at these rallies and he gets booed for being literally, a warmonger. But he could turn around and say, hang on a minute, we live in complex times, there's some very difficult decisions to make here. He could turn around and say to the critics in the party, what about the Greens? The Greens, as I said earlier, started off on a militantly pacifist ticket. No nukes, no NATO, no Bundeswehr, German army. And even in their 2021 election manifesto, so the election that just took place last September, even in that manifesto, they said, no German weapons abroad. And now they've become the most strident pro-Ukrainian, send all the heavy weapons you can send, advocates in the ruling coalition. And it's partly might is never right. In other words, it's good versus evil. But also, they see this as a unique opportunity to wean Germany finally off the carbohydrates that Russia has been shoving down German export throats.
Do you think, in all the criticism of Olaf Scholz and his sort of dithering over what to do in terms of, cutting off Russian energy, in terms of sending aid to Ukraine, is there some sympathy we can have in terms of not just the weight of the past, but as you talk about the geography of where Germany is and how, for them, it's a bit more complicated than it is for us here and as an island nation?
I think several things here. First of all, dithering is what Germans do. It's partly because, there was an example of them doing the opposite a long time ago. They don't want to repeat that. So incremental change, easy as she goes, steady as she goes, that is the German way of doing politics. Partly also predicated by the fact that these are coalition governments. So if you go too fast in one direction, your coalition is going to fall apart. So Scholz is balancing his coalition, his own internal divisions in his own party, but also, as you say, the kind of weight of history. And I think, to be honest, it's very easy for us, to point fingers at Germany and say, look at them, they're dithering. But actually, the Germans could easily turn around and say, look at you in London. You were the laundromat for Russian money for all those years. You made the son of a KGB officer who's now an oligarch, a member of the House of Lords. I mean, everyone's got, a couple of skeletons in their cupboard on this one. And pointing fingers is not particularly helpful. It is also easier, I think, for this country, and also to some extent motivated by domestic political requirements of this Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to be in the war party, as it were. Having said that, what Scholz has not been good at is finding a language, a subtle language, using all those composite German nouns that they like to use, that actually illustrates the very difficult path that he's treading. And I think that's where he's shown a degree, not complete lack of leadership, because I think he's a smart man, and I think he's smart and he calculates the issues probably more than other politicians I know who like to shoot from the hip, and maybe that's the right thing to do. And if you look at the actual weaponry that they're sending, the Germans are sending, as much as the Brits, if not more. So it depends how you want to calculate it in terms of range or firepower. But, both countries are sending a lot of stuff.
Because I guess finally, if Germany is in this sort of tight position and a difficult position, and it's thinking about its history. It's very fascinating for me when you read that individuals like Zelensky and other European allies are questioning Germany's commitment to international law and the free world. That's definitely not what they want to be known for or being questioned about, given the weight of the history.
Well, no. I mean, the Germans will say, we can't win. If we do too much, you're going to accuse us of, reinventing, the Third Reich. If we do too little, then we're lily-livered peacemongers. The reality and the right way probably lies somewhere in between. And I think Scholz is getting there incrementally. But at the moment, and I can totally see the Ukrainian calculation, they're desperate because for them, the clock is always ticking down. They need that heavy stuff as fast as they can get their hands on it because they need it right now to stop the Russians, in the Donbass region, in Severodonetsk, in all these places. And they're losing. At the moment, they are losing. They're losing, as Zelensky said himself, 100 men a day. And again, there's that extraordinary image of Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, and the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi all traveling by train to Kyiv. They sit in the presidential palace with Zelensky. He's wearing a T-shirt. They all wear their suits. And I'd love to have been a fly on the wall because the conversation would have been something like this, I imagine, at its most brutal. Perhaps never stated clearly, but there, nonetheless. We will make sure that you get to become members of the European Union. You're on a fast-track membership scheme. We will guarantee that that will happen, but at some stage, not now, but at some stage, you may have to say goodbye to bits of your country. That may happen. And at the moment, of course, it's politically impossible for Zelensky to say yes to this. I asked him this question the other day in a press conference. He got very upset with me. But that is what it comes down to. Land for peace. And it's not I'm not advocating that for 1 minute. I'm just saying that is probably one of those calculations. The trouble is that only works if you actually trust Vladimir Putin and the Russians to stick to the line that's agreed, to stick to the agreement. And at the moment, no one has any reason to trust them to do any of that.
Matt Frei, thank you very much for talking to me.
Pleasure, as always.